So economies may not be able to grow forever, and that's increasingly seeming quite clear. And the capitalist economies of which neoclassical economists were speaking of, the type of capitalist economies of which they're speaking, are these market economies. Now, another issue came up with neoclassical economists about the assumptions related to these market economies. Neoclassical economists seem to frame them as if they're naturally occurring things in nature. That is called market fundamentalism, the assumption that markets are real and natural. But historians started to really question that entire idea that it could be possible that markets exist naturally in society. So they started looking at this question. Neoclassical neoliberal economics is framed by this suggestion that governments should not regulate the market, that there's something out there called a market that naturally exists, and governments shouldn't touch it. You can see here by this definition by Investopedia, what is a free market? It's an economic system based on supply and demand with little or no government interference or control. And you can see here's a flash learn economics definition of what are free market forces. Supply and demand and other natural mechanisms in free markets that work to create a new equilibrium. You see that word natural in there. Supply and demand are natural mechanisms in free markets, and the equilibrium is supposed to be a natural thing as well. So markets in this respect are described really as Adam Smith did in The Wealth of Nations, not in his other work, but in The Wealth of Nations. And they're, as the result, they exist naturally as the result of natural human greed causing individuals to trade and barter in order to get the best things they can and the most of what they want. Right? And if humans are trading their work and trading their goods and bartering naturally, a thing called a market will appear. And this is as natural as any other thing in nature, according to neoclassical economic theory. But markets themselves, when you look at them more closely, are constructed by government. Governments make them through rules, regulations, and manipulations. Economic historians have seen this over and over again, that the free market, the capitalist free market, is actually a human social construction. It's a thing that's created by governments. Governments invent things called commodities and enforce these into existence through laws, and only through the invention of these commodities are markets even possible. What is a commodity? That's just privately owned things that can be traded, right? So if I have something of mine, I have this. This is a coaster with a skull on it. I have this. If I can define this legally as mine, then this is a privately owned thing. And I can then say to you that I would trade this for a pencil. That has become a commodity that can be traded. If I don't own this thing legally, I can't trade it with you. So that's what a commodity is. Privately owned things that can be traded. Commodities, it turns out, very rarely exist in nature. And much of the preliminary research for this came from the sort of path-breaking and probably one of the most famous publications in the history of social science, that is Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation, a book about the creation of market society, the creation of the society we have today, which Polanyi argued is a society that is governed by these things called free markets. For Polanyi, the creation of this society required the creation by government through coercion and violence of a free market. In order for markets to exist, according to Polanyi, three particular commodities had to be enforced through coercion into existence by the government. That is, labor had to be made into a commodity. to be bought and sold. Land had to be made into a commodity to be bought and sold. And money had to be made into a commodity to be bought and sold. And never in history, or very rarely in history, have these things ever been thought of by societies as commodities, things you can own to buy and sell. Certainly, Polanyi said, sometimes in the past people have made things and said, well, I made this, so this is mine, and they bought and sold it. But to Polanyi's argument, labor is not something you can just make. That's a human and their work. Land, no human made land, so that is why most societies, up until the point of the creation of market society, most societies thought of land as something you just couldn't own as an individual. And money, that was just a medium of exchange. And we're not going to talk about too much about the money commodity right now. We will a little bit at the end of this lecture. But we're going to talk about the other two and how they were created. So what you have to do to understand the creation of these first two fictitious commodities, labor and land, is to think about the historical transformation that Karl Polanyi was writing about. Okay, he is talking about a movement from feudal society in Europe and in the Americas as well to a market society. This was a time, the feudal society that was in existence before market society was a colonial society. So let's remember that. The colonial society was in Europe. This meant rule of kings, where kings were said to be placed in power by God, and the kings owned everything in the land, all the money, all the land. That was the domain of the kingdom. It was the property of God, and the king was there to look after it. So nobody could own their own wealth. Nobody could own their own labor or land. That was all the property of the king. And this wasn't uncommon in human history. Not being able to own land is the most common way that land was viewed throughout the entirety of human history. Okay, now these kings in that sort of feudal system presided over colonial empires. Imagine England became the biggest empire in the world. The kings used these merchants who owned ships and things like that to aid in that colonization by bringing goods that were taken from colonies over to England, for example. And these merchants who owned the ships and the shipping became very, very wealthy. The merchants led these famous, we've discussed this before, revolutions. French Revolution, American Revolution, the revolutions in England, etc., etc. All over Europe, there were revolutions in the name of these things, liberty and democracy. But tied to these revolutions were things called private property laws. So once the revolutions were successful, essentially placing the merchants, the wealthy merchants, as the powerful in those societies, they wrote constitutions. And within those constitutions, they said there is a thing called private property, and it will be enforced through military coercion by the government. That was embedded in every constitution in these new type of governments that were the post-feudal governments. Land was the beginning of this. The land, which was all the property in England, for example, of the king, now became private for purchase, and the government, much of that government land was sold wholesale to the merchants, because the merchants were the only ones who had the money really to buy it. When the merchants had that land, they engaged in this thing called enclosure. And that's why I have enclosure written by Labor and Land here. It was the enclosure movement. It was numerous laws in England that said you could own land and you could keep everybody else from using your land once you own that. So what happened? Wealthy merchants bought most of the land in England. They evicted the poor peasants that lived there. And remember, those peasants had lived there for generations and generations. So those peasants who had lived kind of subsistence lifestyles for generations were now evicted from the land they had historically used. It was put in the Constitution that this private property, whether it was for land or other commodities, was to be protected. No government could take it away. And that made sense, of course, to these merchants because they had just left a feudal system where the king could take whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and could take your wealth if he felt he needed to. Well, the new constitutions, here's the example of the Fifth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, for example, says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This is a new thing, invention of property and the protection through military coercion, the coercive violent abilities of the state to repress its own population. That is what is to be used to protect private property. Polanyi says this is how land became property in the first place. And once land was property, you evict the people living there, and then all of a sudden that is how labor is made to be a commodity, because what you get when you evict people from the land is desperate people looking for jobs. And this is a picture depicting industrial England, early industrial England. You have masses of desperate, unemployed people trying to get work in these factories. And Polanyi even suggested that the classical economists looking around at that time, when they were creating the model of Homo economicus, they looked at these desperate people and how they were fighting just for food. They were desperate to do anything to get work, just to get ahead. He said that they were looking at these people in this very unnatural environment, and that's where they got the ideas that humans are always sort of desperate and greedy. Nonetheless, this is the situation that this fictitious commodification resulted in. And Polanyi didn't think that led to any sort of good place, because it meant this. I'll read the quote from Polanyi. This commoditization and creation of market society, it means no less than the running of society as an adjunct to the market. Instead of the market being embedded in social relations are now embedded in the economic system. Essentially, we have a new God. The God is called the market, and it forces us to do things. That is coercive control because, of course, that market is backed by military and police forces. What did Polanyi say was the historical result of this? Well, he saw this. He wrote this publication in 1944, and he was looking back at that immediate history. And he said, to allow the market mechanism to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment would result in the demolition of society. The demolition he was talking about was the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War. He said all of these horrors were the result of people not being able to direct the economy to do what they wanted it to do, as was most of history, but having to obey an economy that is a social construction that has very rigid laws that are enforced through force, physical force, and coercion. Now, the unnaturalness of certain commodities becomes really apparent when you look at what I call the fourth fictitious commodity, and this comes from a paper I published in around 2008. This commodity came along after what Polanyi was writing about, but really shows how governments create markets. And this commodity is in information, knowledge, and culture. Now, these things naturally exist free to share. If I get an idea, if I say a sentence to you, you can go tell your friend the same sentence and nobody's going to charge you any money for that, naturally, in the natural environment. Ideas are free. They circulate freely without a price tag attached to them. You can commoditize these ideas if you have a very powerful government and legal system, and that's what happened. These are commoditized through what we call intellectual property rights. These are things called like patents or copyrights. Patents are applied to inventions. For example, I've invented the iPhone, I can patent it. A copyright is applied to something like a work of art, like a piece of music or a piece of literature. That's a copyright. And then there are trademarks. These are names of brands and things like that that you can trademark. Of course, none of these exist in nature, and they entirely require very complicated rules and regulations created by government to even exist. So this market is clearly socially constructed. However, it's really, really important. 41% of the US economy and 84% of corporate value in the United States is reliant on intellectual property rights. It's kind of most of the economy right now. And that increases year after year as we go further into what's called the information economy. But this economy is entirely made from commodities, which are created by governments through very complicated regulations, taking something that is naturally free, an idea, and making it into a commodity through rules. Now, there are arguments about it. Innovation in a capitalist economy comes from numerous places, right? First, how do you innovate? Well, you share knowledge. I get an idea, we talk about it, and we create these multiple ideas. We get other ideas that are generated from that, and someone over there hears about our idea, and they get an idea based on that. And a lot of innovation is created through the free sharing of knowledge. But another way in which innovation occurs is through profit incentives. If I get a good idea, I'll make a lot of money. So there are two different ways to have innovation. Profit incentives, unfortunately, make it so free sharing of knowledge is impossible because you have to pay a fee to even share in that knowledge if that knowledge is commoditized. So there's a tension within this fourth fictitious commodities. Some have argued that IPRs actually decrease innovation because they make new information and information sharing and therefore innovative ideas. They make that too costly. And some have argued that IPRs increase innovation because they give an incentive. If I invent something, I'll make a lot of money. That's being discussed by a lot of economists and social scientists and study what is the best way to deal with IPRs. But one thing that is for sure is they are entirely not natural. They are government created. Most of the economy of the world is created through the patenting and through the creation of these intellectual property rights globally. Without government, the market would not exist. And you get some interesting stories with that help you to think through what intellectual property rights, how they should exist, if they should exist, what should the form be. Do you need profit incentives for innovation to happen? Not really. Look at this. The World Wide Web, the internet was invented publicly and made free. That technology was made free throughout the entire world. Nobody made money off the invention of the internet, and that has transformed human society. On another level, from another direction, Happy Birthday to You, a song that is shared freely amongst people at every birthday party and has been in the English world for generations. Actually, until 2015, it was struck down in 2015. Until 2015, it was the property of the Warner Music Corporation. That means that nobody could sing Happy Birthday to You in a movie. That's why you get all those weird movies with people inventing weird happy birthday songs, and they weren't able to sing Happy Birthday to You, because if they did, Time Warner would go and get them, or the Warner Music Company would go and get them. That's now public domain, so don't worry, you can freely sing Happy Birthday to you. But it shows you how kind of strange it can be to create a patent. That is a song that's shared, and the only reason it's popular is because people shared it over and over again. The average person did work to transmit that through generations and generations. And a company comes along, puts a puts a copyright on it and says, we own that and you can't use it. So it's almost, some people have said that they're kind of mining culture to try and steal economic value from it through copyrights. These are the kinds of issues you get into. Similar issues with Barbie. Shrink a human down, while maybe it's not always the most accurate depiction of a human body, but shrink one down to tiny doll size and make it out of plastic. That's a Barbie. And Barbie has trademarked the name Barbie, but they've also gone after and kind of sued people for using images that look like Barbies, which is kind of strange because plastic is pretty much the most common human material, and that's just a shrunk down human in doll form. But it allows for that ownership, which allow a lot of lawyers really to get involved to try and extract value from human activity. More recently, ChatGPT, chatbots were invented with patented. They were patented to in order to make money, essentially. But the content that they use is everybody's content. They're scraping the internet, so to speak, our words, and there's a lot of controversy over whether chatbots should be allowed to take content that's public, that's free, or content that's not free and use it in their new chatbot form. The iPhone, that's something that was patented. It was patented, but it wasn't even the first smartphone. And Apple's been very aggressive on suing other companies for making phone devices even in this shape. Is that innovation, or is that just extraction of value out of the creation of false ownership of ideas, right? And insulin, here's another example. This is another example of a good that did not need a profit incentive to be invented. It was invented by researchers at the University of Toronto and made freely available free for just a little bit over $1, I think was the charge for everyone in the world to use the idea of insulin, which was really important for humanity. Very interesting. And when you step back to the iPhone, the interesting thing about the iPhone is probably about 70 to 80% of the technology in the iPhone was actually developed by government, free from patents or copyright, and given freely to the world. But then Apple gets those ideas, puts them together, puts a little Apple on them, patents that and trademarks that, more importantly for Apple, and then you have a commodity that's fictitious, that is traded. So that's the story of the fourth fictitious commodity. And as I said, it really makes it clear how government creates the market. So here are some important general observations about this section. First, a government is a social institution that exercises power and authority to manage and regulate a community or a state. That's the standard sociological definition of what a government is. So a government doesn't have to be just a bunch of buildings in Washington or Ottawa or London or whatever. A government is a consistent system of control and rules that emerges within a group. It could be a small hunting and gathering society. It could be communal and collaborative and equal, or it could be oppressive and controlling. That's different types of government. But government itself is very natural, and we do see in every type of human society throughout history. What we don't see in every type of human society throughout history are markets. In most political discourses, arguments between the right and the left wing, for example, we're not talking about the removal of government regulation, but just in changing the type of government regulation. The market we haven't seen throughout history very often, and the reason for that is because it was created by a particular type of government at a particular time. But arguments about keep the government out of the market, those don't make very much sense because the government created the market and is the market and is constantly creating the market. So these are kind of misformed arguments when you think about it. Between what we sometimes call left and right, that's just arguments over what kind of government intervention do we want, not whether we want government intervention or not. It's all government intervention. Another important point is that there's no type of economy that is natural. We can construct any type we want. We went through a lot of work, a lot of coercion, a lot of theorizing, creating a lot of institutions in order to create a thing called a market economy. And we can do that for any sort of economy, really, in the future.